In today's video, we're gonna cover how to make boom bap beats using 90s R&B samples. I'm gonna show you some really helpful sampling techniques, drum pattern tips, helpful effects for making boom bap, and a lot more. So after you watch this video, you're gonna walk away with lots of key tips to help you make better beats. Here is a preview of the beat that we're gonna be making. Now to make this style of boom bap, we're gonna need to do some sample manipulation to get our sample to fit with this style of beat. And already this might be something that you struggle with, where you can't seem to figure out how to get your sample to fit with your other sounds that you're trying to add. So let's go over how you can do this. First up though, let's take a listen to the actual sample we're gonna be using.
Never have to question me and no.
Now this is a great sample. It has that minimal section in the beginning that will give us some material for our main loop, but it also has more open areas with vocals that we can use for the detail in our beat. But before we make a beat out of this sample, like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below and I'll be replying to any and all comments within the first few hours of this video releasing. Even the mean ones. For example, look at this rude comment this guy left on my channel. Yeah, I mean, everything he said is true, but he didn't even compliment me on my beautiful eyelashes. Sometimes you guys can just be so mean. Anyways, let's begin with our sample. From first listen, this phrase right here is really loopable. So let's not go overboard and make forced chops and rearrange this sample just for the sake of it. This is something that I talked about in a recent sampling video about the differences between amateur samplers and experienced ones. My intention here is to make a good beat, even if that means I just loop the sample. Having said that though, I can already tell that we're gonna run into a few problems with this sample, even if we just loop it. Let me show you why. You can hear that there are inconsistent drums throughout this loop. We have that really loud clap that shows up twice during the loop. We have that smaller rim earlier. We also have that crash that starts to show up towards the end of the loop. If we're making a boom bap beat out of this sample, this is gonna be a problem. The reason being, we want to add our own drums into this beat, ones that match a boom bap aesthetic. And the problem is that once we add our own drums into this loop, we'll end up with an uneven drum pattern. Some drum sounds will have claps underneath them, others won't, and this will cause our beat to sound inconsistent. So we're gonna have to get rid of those claps with some creative chopping. So here's what we can do. First, we'll place one chop right after the clap here. And in our loop, we're gonna place this chop where our clap originally played. Now, once we get to this chop, when we play our loop, we'll have effectively removed the clap from the actual sample. So that solves one problem, but now we run into another problem. Since we basically removed a small fraction from the sample, the rest of our sample is now playing just a fraction early now. So to solve this, we're gonna have to do some more creative sampling. We're gonna slow this chop down and place another chop right after it at normal speed and use this at the beginning of our second bar. This way, once we get to the second bar, our sample is gonna be back on time again. And this is why, for the millionth time, I recommend using actual sampling tools like I talked about in my recent sampling video. Next, we can do the exact same thing with the second clap in our loop. But I'm gonna do a bit of a smarty pants move here. You can hear that right after this clap, we start to have that reverse crash start to play. This is gonna sound awkward since it will abruptly end as soon as we loop back to the beginning. So instead of using this chop here at the end of our loop, we're gonna use this chop instead, since it's the exact same note and it leads back into the first chop of this loop anyways. And there we go. We now have a cleaner loop that doesn't have those big claps that get in the way. And this type of sample manipulation is going to be really helpful if you just have random sounds that show up through your sample and you need to create something that's more consistent. By being creative with where you place your chops and using time stretching, you can more easily remove sounds and mask them without having your sample sound disjointed. Moving on, let's also pitch the sample up. With a lot of soulful boom bap beats, they include higher pitched vocal samples throughout, so pitching our entire sample up will help us achieve this. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is that while we did get rid of those claps, we still have that side stick here in the beginning. Now, I don't necessarily think this is going to be a problem though, since this is a much quieter sound and it could sit underneath our boom bap drums once I do bring them in. The problem with this sound though is that it's just playing at one part of our loop, which will create that inconsistency once again. So we can either chop this sound out the same way that we did with our clap so that it never plays, or we can clone this sample out, isolate that side stick, and have this side stick play throughout our loop whenever we have a snare hit once we bring in our own drums. So that sounds pretty good. Let's go ahead and use some effects to clean up this sample even more though. Our plan is to add in our own drums, and this sample has a kick playing throughout. This can easily be fixed by grabbing an EQ and just cutting out a lot of the low end. Now this is something that I couldn't do with my clap just because there were so many adjacent instruments in that frequency area. It just would have been impossible to cut just the clap out without affecting other sounds. Now after I made this cut, you'll have noticed that we ended up cutting our bass line as well though. So we'll have to replace that. Let's start by finding a bass that sounds similar to the original. Many of these older 90s R&B songs use synth basses, so we'll go into Omnisphere and check that category out. This bass here sounds like it might do the job. All we need to do is EQ some of those brighter frequencies out. And it sounds like we have a fitting bass tone here. Next, let's figure out what notes were in the original bass line. We can do this by taking a look at Wave Candy and seeing what notes are down here before we EQ them away. Next, let's move on to the drum pattern. Let's go through my library of drum loops to see if we can find one that fits with this beat. This one here actually sounds like it might work well with our sample. In case you're wondering, these are Beat Batter drum kits that I'm listening to. They aren't sponsoring this video or anything, but they are my go-to for boom bap drums. A link to their site is in the description box below if you're interested in checking them out. They really do great work. So to bring this drum pattern into Fruity Slicer, this makes it easy and quick to make adjustments if we need to. One change that might be a good idea is to remove this section from the drum pattern. We have this busier open hi-hat pattern. Having this play every single bar might feel a bit too repetitive, so let's delete this section of the drum loop and replace it with another section that's a bit more straightforward. Next, let's do a bit of processing on this drum loop. Adding decapitator is always helpful when it comes to beefing up your drums. Let's also fatten up the drum sounds by using a transient processor. This will let me extend how long each note plays for, which can help me fill up more space in my beat a little bit more easily. While this does sound better, I think there are some missing frequencies that this drum loop isn't providing. The character of this drum loop's definitely there, but the content just isn't. So let's layer this hi-hat on top of the drum loop to brighten it up. And we'll also add this kick layer underneath our drum loop to help provide a bit more punch. So here's a before and after. This beat's really sounding complete. Let's add in a few more percussive layers. There's this little woodblock sound in the sample that I really like, but it's pretty faint. So let's do the same thing that we did with our rim shot and isolate it and use it as a layer in our beat. Let's also add our own layer of bongos underneath and use this more in the stereo space. This will help provide a wider presence into the beat, since we can't really do that with the instruments in our sample. It sounds like we have a core loop complete here. Let's continue to add in more layers though, just so we have enough material that we can use for the hook section or a switch up during the arrangement process. As I mentioned earlier, using vocals from our sample can be a great idea for a layer in the beat. Adding something a bit more musical could be a good idea as well. Let's grab this flute here and build something that sounds good. Now this isn't something that we're going to play throughout the entire beat. I'll pick and choose when in the beat I'll play this, as you will see soon. And by the way, this flute is from a one-shot pack that you can only get by joining my course. If you like these over-explained videos where I spend 15-20 minutes going into detail about what I'm doing and why I'm doing everything, Better Beatmaker, my full online beatmaking course, is the next level up, where I spend multiple hours going into every important detail over every beatmaking decision you need to make in order to make better beats. I've had a member go from never having made a beat to working with artists in just 6 months, which is insane. My other members are now making an income with their production, so as you can see, this course just helps you get really good really fast. If you're interested, the link should be showing up somewhere on the screen right now. Anyways, back to the beat. I'm going to take this flute pattern and duplicate it out and make something similar using this bell one shot, which also comes from my course pack. And I think using these throughout the different parts of my beat would be a good idea. Speaking of which, let's just go ahead and jump to the arrangement so I can show you what I did. As you can see, I used the flute pattern partway through the verse section in the second half, and then I transitioned into the hook section. And this is where I used the bells. I experimented with using halftime and doing some filtering onto the sample during the hook, but I just didn't like it quite as much as just letting the original loop continue to play. But enough gum flapping, let me go ahead and play the full beat for you. Before I do, if you want to check out any of the videos that I mentioned during this one, every link is in the description box below. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. And once again, head over to betterbeatmaker.com if you really like these beatmaking over explained videos. My course is basically like the next level from that. My free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to my Discord if you want to join my producer community. Anyways, here's the full beat.